He thought it was just another quiet night and just another steak. But when the young waitress leaned in and whispered 5 words, this elderly veteran froze, his eyes wide with shock. No one in that diner could believe what happened next. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. He just wanted a steak. Nothing fancy, just something warm to end another long, lonely day. Henry Walker, a 78-year-old, retired Army veteran, pushed open the squeaky door of Rosie's Diner, the same cozy spot he'd been coming to for years. He wore his old black cap, the one with the faded American flag pin, and a red plaid shirt that had seen better days. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, shaking off the summer's humid air. Most people who saw him thought he was just another old man who liked to sit alone. Few knew that he'd spent 2 decades serving overseas, that he'd seen deserts, jungles, and battlefields most people only heard about on the news. Fewer still knew about the friends he'd buried on foreign soil, or that his wife, Mary, had passed 10 years ago. Since then, the only thing that felt close to home was the photo of her he kept tucked in his worn leather wallet. Her smile, frozen in time, looking at him the way no one else ever did, sliding into his favorite corner. Booth, Henry sighed as his bones settled against the cracked red leather seat. The diner hadn't changed much in all these years. Same checkered floor, same humming neon sign in the window that read open 24 hours. It smelled like coffee, fried eggs, and the hint of pie warming behind the counter. He didn't come here just for the food. He came for the warmth of the coffee, the warmth of the lights, and the faint warmth of knowing that in a world that moved too fast and forgot people like him, Rosie's Diner always stayed the same. A young waitress named Jenny came over, her ponytail bobbing behind her as she tucked her pen behind her ear. She couldn't have been more than 22, but she always called him Mr. Walker, like he was someone important. "Good evening, Mr. Walker," she said, her smile genuine. "The usual tonight?" Henry nodded, his voice rough but kind. "1 medium steak, sweet tea, please. And maybe a piece of that peach pie, if you've got any left." Jenny winked. "You're in luck. Rosie made it fresh this morning. I'll get that started for you." As she walked away, Henry leaned back and looked around. A young couple sat at the counter, laughing over milkshakes. A tired trucker nursed a mug of coffee in the corner. In a booth near the door, a father tried to feed bites of grilled cheese to a fussy toddler. Life kept moving, all around him, and sometimes Henry felt like a ghost drifting through it, visible but not quite there. His eyes wandered to the window, where rain had started to tap gently against the glass. He thought of Mary, how she used to tease him about always ordering steak no matter where they went. "One day, I'm going to turn into a cow if I keep feeding you beef every night," she'd joke, swatting him playfully with a dish towel. That he smiled at the memory, then quickly blinked it away. The truth was, nights like this were the hardest. The TV back home would be waiting for him, a static-filled companion to fill the silence. But there was no warmth in that. Not like here. Jenny returned with his sweet tea, setting it down with a clink. "You need anything else, Mr. Walker?" He shook his head. "This is plenty, thank you." When his steak finally came, simple, cooked just right, with a side of mashed potatoes and a single sprig of parsley he'd never touch, he paused. He bowed his head for a moment, whispering a small prayer. Not just for the meal, but for Mary, for his old buddies he still saw in his dreams. For one more good day. The first bite was warm and familiar. He took his time, cutting small pieces, chewing slowly, savoring each taste like a memory you didn't want to let go of. Jenny would check in now and then, topping off his tea, asking if he wanted more gravy. Always kind, always patient. When the pie came, he almost laughed. The peach filling oozed just a bit over the flaky crust. Mary used to bake pies just like that in the summers, peaches from their own tree out back. He closed his eyes, tasting not just sugar and fruit, but a moment of something sweet he thought he'd lost forever. As he paid his check, always leaving a tip that Jenny insisted was way too much. He stood at the door for a moment. The rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh. He looked back at Rosie's Diner, warm light spilling onto the dark street. He knew he'd be back tomorrow, and maybe the day after that. Because sometimes, all a man needed was a warm steak, a kind word, and a corner booth where the world slowed down just enough to remember he was still here. Henry Walker pushed open the door and stepped into the night, the faint jingle of the bell lingering behind him. A small promise that he wasn't as alone as he felt. Tonight, though, there was something different. The girl who took his order wasn't Rosie, the owner, or any of the usual faces he'd gotten used to seeing behind the counter over the years. She was new, young, maybe 22 at most, with blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail and tired eyes that still managed to sparkle when she smiled. Her name tag read Lily, written in blue ink that had already smudged at the edges. "Evening, sir," she'd said softly, pulling a pencil from behind her ear and flipping open her small notepad. "Steak and sweet tea, got it." Her voice was gentle, the kind that made you think she was used to being careful with her words, like she'd learned young that some people could break too easily. Henry smiled politely, the corners of his eyes crinkling under the brim of his old black cap, and gave her a small nod. He didn't expect anything more than what he came for every night. A hot meal, and maybe a slice of pie if he had room. He turned to look out the rain-speckled window as she scribbled his order. Outside, Main Street was empty except for the occasional car splashing through shallow puddles. The neon sign in the diner's window buzzed faintly. The world outside felt cold and damp, but in here, the air smelled of coffee and fried food. And that was enough. When she came back a few minutes later with his glass of sweet tea, she set it down gently in front of him, careful not to spill a drop. Henry murmured a soft thank you and reached for the glass, his fingers brushing the condensation. But she didn't move away right away. She lingered for a second, her eyes drifting to the old, faded American flag pin on the brim of his cap. "You served?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear it over the clatter of dishes and the hum of the kitchen. Henry paused, then gave her the same answer he gave everyone who bothered to ask. "A long time ago." She nodded, biting her lip like she wanted to say something more. There was something in her eyes, a question, maybe, or a story she hadn't decided whether to share yet. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Her smile reappeared, soft but somehow sad. "Well, thank you," she said, her voice even softer now. "For your service." Henry gave a small grunt of acknowledgement. He never knew what to say to that anymore. Your welcome never seemed right. He'd buried too many good men to ever feel like the thanks belonged to him alone. So instead, he gave her another polite nod, lifted his glass, and took a sip of the sweet tea, letting the cold sweetness coat his throat. Lily hovered for a second longer, then tucked her notepad back into her apron pocket and drifted back toward the kitchen. Henry watched her go, wondering what her story was. She moved quickly, but every so often she'd pause by the counter, tapping her pen against her notepad, staring off at nothing. He knew that look. He'd seen it in young soldiers fresh off the plane, in widows in waiting rooms, in his own mirror some mornings. When she brought his plate out, steak done medium, just the way he liked it, with mashed potatoes and green beans on the side, she didn't just drop it off and hurry away. Instead, she slid into the empty side of his booth without asking, balancing the tray against her hip. "I hope you don't mind me sitting for a second," she said quickly. "Rosie says we're supposed to take our breaks when it's slow, and, well, I just didn't feel like sitting by the mop sink tonight." Henry raised his eyebrows, but shrugged. "Seats free," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't seem to mind. For a moment, they just sat there. Henry cut into his steak, savoring the warmth that spread through him with each bite. Lily didn't speak at first, just watched the rain trail down the window beside them. Finally, she glanced at him, her fingers tracing circles on the sticky tabletop. "My brother, he served too," she said, almost in a whisper. "Army. She stopped, swallowing hard. "He's back now. Mostly. Some days, though some days he's not really here at all." Henry paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He lowered it back to the plate and looked at her. Really looked at her, at the way her shoulders tensed. When she talked, at the worry lines on a face too young for worry lines. "It's hard," he said quietly. It was all he could offer. He didn't have fancy words for it. Just the truth. Sometimes, being back is the hardest part. Lily nodded, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She offered him a shaky smile. "He always loved peach pie. Maybe I'll bring him a slice tonight. Might help, you know." Henry's chest tightened, a memory flickering like An old film reel. Mary, the kitchen warm with the smell of peaches, her laughter echoing down the hall. He pushed the thought down and gave Lily the only thing he could, understanding. Pie helps more than people think, he said gruffly. They sat there together, an old soldier and a young waitress. For just a minute longer, two strangers bound by stories they didn't have to tell all the way to be understood. And when Lily finally stood and walked back to the counter, Henry turned back to his meal, the steak somehow warmer than it had been a moment ago. When the steak arrived, perfectly cooked just the way he liked it, a warm slab of comfort on a chilly night. Henry thanked her with a polite smile and a soft, "Much obliged, miss." He picked up his fork and knife, steadying them in hands that had once held rifles and maps and letters home. The smell of seared meat and pepper drifted up, and for a second, the world felt simple again. A good meal, a warm booth, rain tapping at the window. What more could a man ask for at 78? But just as he angled the knife to slice through the tender meat, he felt a shift in the air beside him, a shadow that hadn't been there a moment ago. He glanced up, and there she was again, Lily, standing closer now, not hovering like a waitress, but leaning in like someone about to confess something private. Her eyes darted around the diner. The father with the fussy toddler was wiping crumbs off a booster seat. The trucker in the back corner stared into his empty coffee mug like he might find answers at the bottom. The neon sign in the window hummed its blue glow onto the rain-slicked street. But here, at Henry's booth, everything else seemed to fall away. Lily bent down, just enough that her blonde ponytail slipped over her shoulder, the ends brushing the edge of his table. Her voice dropped to a whisper, soft enough that only he could hear it over the clink of silverware and the muted hum of the old jukebox in the corner. She looked him dead in the eye, eyes that were young but carried an ache he recognized instantly. And she said 5 words that made his knife freeze midair. "My dad served with you." Henry's breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. The knife hovered above the steak, forgotten. He turned his head slowly to face her, searching her expression for some sign that he'd misheard her, that maybe this was a mistake, a coincidence, a mix-up. But her eyes held steady on his, serious and soft all at once, like she'd been carrying this secret a long time. The diner noise faded. He didn't hear the dishes clatter in the kitchen or the rain tapping against the glass. All he could hear was the echo of old gunfire, the distant shouting of medics, the memory of desert sand and jungle rain and faces he hadn't let himself remember in years. "Your dad?" he rasped. The word scraped out of his throat like gravel. His voice, strong once, sounded too thin for this moment. She nodded. "I've seen your photo. My mom keeps this old box, full of letters and pictures. She told me stories about you. About how you—" She swallowed, eyes glistening under the cheap diner lights. "About how you pulled my dad out when he got hit by shrapnel. He always said if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't even be here." Henry's chest tightened until he thought it might crack open. A memory came rushing back, uninvited but crystal clear, a night lit up by flares. The smell of smoke and blood, the groaning of a young man clutching his side, calling out for his little girl who hadn't even been born yet. He could still feel the weight of that soldier's body over his shoulder. The desperate sprint through mud and mortar fire, the shouting in his ear, "Tell my baby girl I love her. Tell her." And Henry, breathless and bleeding himself, barking back, "You tell her yourself, you hear me? You hold on." He had. Somehow he'd held on. What was his name? Henry asked, though he already knew. His hands trembled as he set the knife down beside his plate. He didn't care that the steak was getting cold. "David Miller," Lily said, almost too quietly to hear. "My dad's David Miller." Henry closed his eyes. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in decades, but there it was, sharp and alive again. David Miller, the kid who never stopped talking about the baby on the way. How he'd carry her on his shoulders. How he'd teach her to ride a bike. How he'd promised his wife he'd come home. You're his girl." The words came out with a stunned disbelief that made Lily smile. Just a little. She nodded again. "I am. He passed 3 years ago, cancer. But he always said your name. I recognized you the minute you walked in the first night I started here. Rosie said you come here every evening." I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how. Henry felt something behind his eyes, a sting he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. He cleared his throat roughly, pretending to reach for his napkin to wipe his mouth. But really it was to catch the tear that threatened to slip free. "Your dad was a good man," he said. His voice cracked again. "One of the best I ever knew." "I know," she whispered back, her smile trembling. She glanced down at his plate. "Eat your steak before it gets cold, okay? Dad would have yelled at me if I let you waste it." Henry let out a soft, broken laugh, the kind that hurt in the best way. He picked up his knife again, hands still shaking, but not from age this time. As Lily turned to head back to the counter, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "I'm glad you come here, Mr. Walker. I really am." He nodded, unable to say more. He watched her walk away, David Miller's girl, and for the first time in years, Henry's corner booth didn't feel quite so lonely. That Henry's hands shook as he set down his fork, the silver tines clinking too loudly against the heavy ceramic plate. For a moment, he couldn't hear the clatter of dishes or the muted chatter of the diner around him. Only the sudden roar of old memories, bursting through the dam he'd spent decades patching up, mud, smoke, boots slipping in red earth slicked with rain and blood, the crack of gunfire echoing through the trees. He could almost feel the rough canvas of his pack, the weight of another man's arm slung over his shoulders. He could still taste the fear in his mouth, metallic and sour, mixing with the adrenaline that had kept him moving long after his own leg gave out under him. He remembered a name he hadn't spoken in years: Daniel Harris. A kid from Georgia, freckles under his helmet and a grin that didn't belong in a war zone. Barely 20 when he got hit. They'd been pinned down for hours. Enemy fire, so close the ground seemed to breathe bullets. Henry had found Daniel, half buried in mud, bleeding from a jagged tear in his side. He could see it now. Daniel's eyes wide and glassy under the jungle canopy, whispering through cracked lips, "Tell my mom I'm sorry. Tell her I tried." Henry had ignored his own searing wounds and dragged him across that clearing, gunfire tearing through the trees around them. He'd yelled over Daniel's gasps. "You're going to see her yourself, you hear me? You hold on, Harris." Against all odds, the kid had made it home. Henry had promised to write, to visit when he could. But war had a way of scattering people like leaves in the wind. One day he was shipping out again. Next thing he knew, he was sitting on a transport plane wondering if any of them had made it. He never knew what became of Daniel Harris until now. Henry cleared his throat, but it didn't help. His voice came out raw, unsteady. "Your father, is he?" The question hung in the warm diner air, heavy enough to bend his shoulders all over again. The young waitress, Lily, stood beside his booth, her hands clasped tight around her order pad like it was an anchor. She gave him a sad smile, the kind that shouldn't live on a face that young. "He passed away 5 years ago," she said gently, her voice trembling just enough for Henry to hear the ache in it. "Cancer. Mom said it was fast, but not fast enough, you know." She sniffed once, blinked back the tears that threatened to slip down. "But he talked about you until the very end. He told me and Mom's stories about you dragging him out when nobody else could reach him. He said if it wasn't for you, he wouldn't have seen his 21st birthday, wouldn't have met Mom, wouldn't have held me when I was born." She smiled again, the kind of smile that carried both grief and gratitude, and Henry felt something crack open inside him, something he didn't even know was still there to break. "He made Mom promise," Lily continued, her voice steadying, like she'd rehearsed this in her head for years, "that if we ever found you, we'd say thank you. That's it. Just thank you." A lump formed in Henry's throat, so solid he thought he might choke on it. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, as if to keep the memories from pouring out all at once. Around him, the diner went on like it always did, forks scraping plates, an old couple arguing softly about whether to order pie, the jukebox droning out a song he barely recognized. None of them knew that in this corner booth, a piece of the past had come back to life. That he looked at Lily, Daniel's little girl. Not so little anymore. Her ponytail swayed as she shifted her weight from foot to foot, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Slowly, he managed to find his voice. "He was a good kid," Henry said, his words ragged but clear. "Brave. Brave as they come." Lily's eyes glistened. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "He always said the same about you. Mom said he woke up from nightmares sometimes, but when he talked about you, he didn't look scared. He looked proud." Henry exhaled shakily, feeling the weight in his chest loosen just a fraction. All these years, he'd wondered if any of what they'd done had lasted, if the sacrifices had meant anything beyond folded flags and carved stones. Now, standing here in Rosie's diner, he had his answer. A daughter, alive because he'd refused to let a scared kid die alone in the mud. That he wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't been brave, that he'd just been too stubborn to leave a man behind. But all that came out was a whisper, rough as gravel, but warm all the same. Thank you, miss. Thank you for telling me. Lily reached out, squeezing his hand for just a second, warm and real, before she slipped away to check on another table, her apron brushing his knee as she turned. The moment passed, but it left something behind, a warmth that had nothing to do with steak or sweet tea. Henry looked out the rain-slicked window again, the neon sign's reflection flickering across the glass. For the first time in years, the memories didn't feel so heavy. In the corner booth of a simple diner, surrounded by strangers who'd never know the quiet miracle unfolding right beside them, Henry Walker, old soldier, quiet widower, remembered what it felt like to be needed once more. She pulled something from her apron, a small, crumpled photo, its edges yellowed with time. Henry stared at her hand for a second, then reached out with trembling fingers. The diner around him seemed to fade. The soft clink of forks against plates, the low murmur of late-night conversations, the distant sizzle of the kitchen, all of it faded until there was only that photo. He turned it over carefully, almost afraid it might fall apart in his hands. There they were, two young men in dusty fatigues, their faces sunburned and tired, but their smiles wide and fearless. Henry could almost smell the dry desert air, hear the distant whir of helicopter blades, feel the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders. He traced Daniel's face with his thumb. Daniel Harris, the kid who always volunteered to take the point, the kid who kept everyone's spirits up with bad jokes and a harmonica that he never learned to play well. The kid Henry had pulled from the dirt when shrapnel had torn through his leg. Henry's chest ached as memories flooded in. The crack of gunfire, the smell of burning diesel, Daniel's blood on his hands, the desperate prayer that they'd make it to the medic in time. And then, after the war, the promise they'd made to meet up someday. A promise that got buried under years of bills, jobs, marriage, funerals, and all the ways life pushes old friends apart. I didn't know anyone remembered, Henry whispered, his voice a dry rasp that cracked around the edges. The young waitress didn't flinch. She just nodded, eyes shimmering in the diner's soft light. We do. I do. My mom kept a box of old letters and photos. She told me how you saved him, how he always wished he could thank you one more time. He said you were braver than any. Metal. Henry chuckled softly, though it caught in his throat like a stone. I wasn't brave. Just did what anyone would have done. But she shook her head. Not everyone would have done it. He always said you gave him his life, and mine too. Henry looked at her then, really looked. In the curve of her chin, he saw Daniel's stubborn jaw. In the way she tilted her head, he saw Daniel's quiet kindness. She wasn't just a waitress with a kind smile. She was living proof that something good could grow from the worst of times. That he felt his eyes sting. He hadn't cried in front of anyone since Mary's funeral. Now, here he was, an old man in a corner booth, blinking away tears as he clutched a crumpled memory. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him back in the warmth of Rosie's diner. Dinner tonight, it's on me. He'd want that. Henry opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He felt the lump in his throat swell as he looked at her. This young woman who owed her life to a moment he'd long buried. Please, she said softly, squeezing his shoulder with a touch so careful it reminded him of the way nurses used to pat his arm when they changed his bandages. It's the least I can do. Henry nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you for remembering him, for telling me. She gave him a small smile, not forced, not polite, but the kind that held a lifetime of gratitude. Then she took the empty plate from his table and turned away, blending back into the soft chaos of the diner. The clang of dishes, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low laughter of couples sharing pie under neon signs. But for Henry, the room felt different now. Warmer, brighter. He looked down at the photo again. Two kids grinning like fools, believing they were invincible. He slipped it into his wallet behind the photo of Mary, careful not to crease it more than it already was. Then he wrapped both hands around his glass of sweet tea, the ice long melted As he sat there, he let the warmth from the diner lights seep into his bones, pushing out the chill of old regrets and lonely nights. He watched the young waitress, Daniel's daughter, move from table to table, her ponytail swaying, her notepad flipping open and shut as she scribbled orders and poured coffee refills with a smile. And in that moment, Henry understood something he'd forgotten long ago. Sometimes the small moments matter most. A steak, a whisper, a photo pulled from an old apron pocket. He closed his eyes for a second and felt Mary there beside him. Daniel too. Maybe, reminding him that the past never really leaves you. It just waits for the right moment to say thank you. When he opened his eyes again, she was at the register, waving goodbye to a young couple. She turned and caught his eye across the diner, and when she smiled, a simple, silent smile, Henry Walker didn't feel like a lonely old man anymore. He felt like someone who mattered, someone who was remembered, and under the hum of warm lights and the comforting scent of fresh coffee, Henry knew he'd be back tomorrow, and the day after that, not just for the steak, but for the reminder that even the smallest kindness can echo across generations. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true-to-life tales that prove that a simple act of gratitude can change a life forever.